put the detectors there, and they're in control. Israel is basically saying your guys' ability to run things as you have is over. And that's pretty interesting. For the first time since '67, that's taken place. And so if you're in Israel, if you were in Jerusalem right now, it'd be pretty tense. And if we were going there right now, I know that some people would probably want to say, are you crazy? Well, first of all, things happen and they change so quickly there. We don't even go for the first part into Jerusalem. We're not even in there for about 7 days, or about 6 days from our arrival, because we spend all our time up at Galilee first and then down into the Dead Sea area before we come up into Jerusalem. But it is an intriguing time in history over there, and right now the tensions are kind of high. Now we don't even go there for another 7 months, and 7 months is technically an eternity between here and there and that place. There's so much happens so quickly. So all of that said, it is an interesting time when you see Israel finally saying, it's time to stop all of the pretense that we can somehow kind of coexist with the way that things are. I found it interesting that Mahmoud Abbas, if you don't know who that guy is, he's the guy that took over for Arafat after he died. He's the head of the Palestinian Authority. And he basically said, we're done cooperating. And when I read that, I thought, oh, I didn't know you were. And so, the idea that they're not going to cooperate is kind of funny. There's tensions down in Gaza, too, because let's face it, if you don't know the difference between West Bank and Gaza, West Bank is part of Jerusalem, and it's all the stuff that's along the middle part of the country on the eastern border of what is Israel. But there's that little tiny strip that's right where Israel meets Egypt at the Mediterranean Sea, in that little sliver of land. It's run by Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, just straight up terrorist. And so whenever you hear about rockets flying out, it's always coming out of Gaza. And so they are run by terrorists, and the place reflects it, and the people suffer under it. So the tensions are very real there. And so once again, if people were to ask me, are you still planning on going? You bet. I want to go. I don't want to go into a war zone. If there was a problem, they wouldn't let us travel there anyway. They would shut that down. But at this point in time, I believe that we should be supporting them like never before, because all of their enemies are doing their level best to try to ruin them. And this would be a great time to be supporting them. So I'll be going. Let me push this down. It's like right in my face. Enjoy reading the news and staying up to speed on all the things that are happening there. Of course, being prayerful, and I think it was just such an interesting time to make mention of all of that because of where we are in the text this evening. We're in chapter 31 of Genesis, and we're at the point where Jacob is now going back into the land. He's heading back to Bethel. After 20 years of going back to where his mother had come from. So Rebekah was from there. We know that Rebekah was sought for Isaac. And so they sent Jacob after the whole deception. And, Esau was basically saying, I'm going to kill my brother for ripping me off. And so he was gone for 20 years. And now he's coming back into the land. And the intrigues are interesting. If you were here last Sunday night, I had made mention that God brings about His will through very imperfect people. And so it's nothing new. We can go back in the history of Israel and we can find the same thing. And, not to make a big deal of it, but my buddy Rob just walked in. And I want to remind us, not to point out that he's late or anything, but a mutual friend of ours who comes here all the time, usually sits up front. If you see the young guys, and there's a guy who sits over here and Rob sits over here. His name is Mark, and he was involved in an accident last night on his motorcycle. Broke some ribs, collapsed both lungs to some extent, and was really pretty messed up. I just found out about it a short time ago. Do you have an update for us, Rob? Well, you have to look long and hard to find a nicer guy than Mark. And so just a really terrific guy. We love having him around here. He comes on Sunday nights and spends his evenings with us. And so we'll lift him up and pray for the the service and the study tonight, I should say. And we should be able to get through chapters 31, 32. Intriguing, fascinating stuff. So let's begin. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you that we can come to your word, and though we read what is a history, it is a history that has enormous significance to our times. Not just the fact that now Jacob comes back into the land and begins to populate that part of the world, and the tribes take shape and name. God, that history is significant to us. But then there is also the significance of this plot of land, even in our own days, which is in so much dispute, has never been disputed by you. You've made it very clear to whom it belongs. We would ask, Lord, that as we study this history, we would recognize the importance of it, and how you have established it, and how you have sustained it through the ages to this day. We pray, Father, that you would help us to be attentive to your word, and in those times when we can make application to ourselves, we ask, Lord, that you would help us to have ears that would hear. And so we give you thanks for this evening. We give you thanks for your word, and pray that your Spirit would lead us and guide us in truth. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen? Okay, so chapter 31, we read at verse 1, Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all of his wealth. Now, going back to chapter 30, we know that Laban had done his share of kind of backhanded dealings with Jacob, and the fact that he was as prosperous Laban had become as prosperous as he did was because God's hand was on Jacob's work. And so, of course, Laban was really kind of the beneficiary of this. And really, Jacob didn't plan on staying as long as he did, but as soon as he saw Rachel, he was so smitten with her that he was willing to do what was required. And so that was 7 years of service to Laban is what Jacob was willing to pay in order to have Rachel as wife. And we all know the intrigues of that. Instead, he gets Leah, and that was kind of done in a pretty backhanded way by Laban. And so it took another 7 years for him to get Rachel, and then there was another 6 or so years from that point on until he had finally come to this point. Now, what he had done in saying to Laban, hey, now is the time, I have my wives, we've had children, it's time for me to go back, and they strike another deal. And so it's about who's going to get what livestock. And so the question was, well, give me the ones that are the different colored ones. We've studied through that. And so there was distinguishably different types of goats and sheep and all the rest, and whatever were of this particular color belonged to Laban, and the ones that were of that color, they belonged to Jacob. And that would be the way that when he was leaving town, that it would be no dispute which ones belonged to whom. And so that's where we are in the text right here. And so Jacob is ready to go, but the problem is now it is Laban's sons who are saying, hey, this guy came into town, and now everything that he has because of our father. And it's really kind of in reverse. The reason that your father has anything, because he had next to nothing until Jacob came into town, and he was good at what he did. But he was also being blessed by God. And so they have both become the beneficiaries of what God had done. But of course there is the idea of greed and all the stuff that happens in human existence. Well, these guys are saying everything that he has, he acquired from Dad. Verse 2, so Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable towards him as it was before. So not only were there the sons, but they probably have gotten in Dad's ear, and now Laban's heart is starting to turn. Now, if you look at this, you can kind of see from a distance that I think at this point probably God is ready to move them on as well. And he seems to be maneuvering things in place where there's not much of an option left. It's time for him to go ahead and leave. So then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your own family, and I will be with you. Important to remember that because it's going to come up a little bit later. So go back because I'm calling you back. It's time to get you back in the land, and I'll be with you. I'll go before you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field and to his flock, and he said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable towards me as it was before. But the God of my father has been with me, and you know that with all of my might I have served your father. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not allow this hurt to come to me. Now, here's an interesting thing. I mentioned this last week. The irony in some of this is just kind of breathtaking, because let's remember, Jacob wrote the book on deception, didn't he? For the most part. I mean, his mom had something to do with it too. I mean, she was complicit in it too. But isn't it funny that he's saying, man, he's not done rightly by me. And so some of us would say, well, now it's your turn. But nonetheless, Laban did exactly what it was. Regardless of Jacob and how he had dealt with things, the truth of the matter is, yes, Laban had been a real conniver. So, at this point, he says, yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages, verse 7, these 10 times, and God did not allow him to hurt me. And he said thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. And if he said thus, the streaked shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked. So God has taken away the livestock from your father and given them to me. See, here Jacob, if you can see, is kind of building the case. Look, things are about to change in my relationship with your father, but just know he's done me wrong. And though he and I have agreed whose livestock is whose, it seems like everyone that's born of late would belong to me. Not because of anything that I've done, it's just God doing this. So, in case he seems again to be doing this preemptively, when the time comes, just know that I have not dealt underhandedly with your father. So, their reaction is pretty priceless. So, in verse 10, and it happened at the time when the flocks conceived that I lifted up my eyes and I saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the flocks were streaked, speckled, and gray-spotted. And then the angel of the Lord spoke to me in a dream, saying, Jacob, and I said, here I am. Now, notice verse 11. It says, the angel of God. This is a messenger. Now, when you see angel, we don't have to think necessarily of wings and the typical what you would think of angel. Angel simply means messenger. But since, as I read this, there's no transition in this between the angel and then God taking over and speaking. It is a seamless discussion. A dream happens, there is a messenger, and he begins to speak with him. And the way that he ends this little discussion is incredibly interesting. Verse 12. And so he said, lift up your eyes now and see. All the rams which leap on the flocks are streaked, speckled, and gray-spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has done or is doing to you. So it's God saying, the livestock are now, I'm in control of these things. Remember, this is the angel of the Lord speaking. Are we all agreed on that? Now look at what verse 13 says. I am the God of Bethel. This angel refers to himself as the God of Bethel. Interesting. Now, you'll find that by the time that we get to the end of chapter 32, if we get there, there is another such angel or messenger that is spoken of there who has very godlike characteristics as well. So keep all of this in mind. Now, if you remember when he was at Bethel, that was kind of the jumping off point. Because before he went to where Laban is, modern-day Syria, he had stopped at, it just says, this place. And he had that dream of the angels ascending and descending, and he said, God is in this place, or he called it the house of God, Bethel, right? Now it's that this angel, this messenger says to him, I'm the God that you met at Bethel. It's a reminder. So he said, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now, arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your family. This is an imperative that is put here. It doesn't leave open all the options or anything else. I'm the one that you met 20 years ago when you named it Bethel. I'm telling you to come back. Now, if you're Jacob and you hear that, you should know that nothing between then and going back into the land and taking on all of the promises, nothing should come between you and that. Would we agree? But we do notice that what overrides what we know, even the promises of God, when it becomes something that personally could be of distress to us, we seem to forget all of that stuff. Or am I the only one? The rest of you ever have that problem? Yes, of course you do. We forget the promises because what I see with my eyes sometimes overrides what I know in my mind and heart because of what God said. It'll end up playing out. So, then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, "Is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house?" Remember, Jacob said all of this because he's afraid of how they're going to react. And they basically said, "Well, what do we have left? Dad spent everything that would have been ours. Why do we care?" Well, because there would have been dowries, or at least that, if nothing else, the servitude of Jacob all of those years would have had some kind of a price to it, but they're leaving without anything. So, verse 15, "And are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money," or our inheritance, things that should be ours. And so they seem to be pretty frustrated with their father. "For all the riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's now. Then whenever God has said to you, or whatever God has said to you, then do this." So I bet you Jacob is probably walking away from that and saying, "Wow, that went better than I thought." And so, okay, no real problem here. So they continue on. Verse 17, "So then Jacob rose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he carried away all of his livestock and his possessions which he had gained. His acquired livestock which he had gained in Padan Aram, and to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan." Now Laban had gone to shear the sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were that belonged to her father, that were her father's. Now, part of me just laughs when I read this. There are a lot of, it's funny when you read, historians and scholars and all the rest of it, they start to go into what all is behind this. Why would she have taken the idols? Did they have some kind of a monetary value? Or did they ensure that there would be some kind of an inheritance to her husband because whoever had the household or the family idols was also the heir? And they start to go into all of this kind of stuff. Look, Jacob and Leah and Rachel and the servants and the kids, they are all leaving town and they're not coming back. Whatever potential inheritance that there would have been in Syria is going to be gone with them. It's funny because you read this. Let's face it, her dad was Laban. She's seen how he had dealt with Jacob. It may very well be that she ripped off the family's idols out of spite. Now, that would make perfect sense. And of course, I have to beg the question, if they're idols and if they're gods, can you steal them? If somebody wound up at my house and said, "I'm here to steal your God," good luck with that. Have at it. Let's see how that works out for you. I'll just sit right here and watch. Well, she manages to grab the family idols, and they're so small that they can fit in basically the saddlebags of her camel. So this is pretty funny to me, because I've got kind of that twisted sense of humor. I think, man, how small is your God? Now, I'm going to become like really geeky here. Growing up, I was a Trekkie. I enjoyed Star Trek and all that stuff. I think it was only the second or the third episode of the Star Trek movies where at one point this is so nerdy. They're on they're on a planet, and this God figure appears to them and asks for their ship. And so Captain Kirk says, "Excuse me, why does God need a ship?" And so he gets pretty messed up because of it. But I'm at the same place. If your God is found in your idols, why can't he move on his own? And why does he fit in the saddlebags of a camel? Now, you're going to also notice that Laban is still so twisted over this that even when God speaks to him, he's still upset about his idols being stolen. Instead of just saying, "Wow, the idols don't mean nothing when there's a God who can speak directly to me." Isn't that bizarre? Well, so, do you guys find this comical? All right. So, verse 19. "So Jacob stole away unknown to Laban the Syrian, in that he did not tell him what he had intended to do. And so he fled with all that he had, and he arose and crossed over the river and headed towards the mountains of Gilead." Now, the mountains of Gilead you can see. When we go to Israel, you can see them. They're basically, it's the Jordans to the west. They're in what is modern-day Jordan, but you can see them. They're kind of in the backdrop. So depending on where you are, if you're looking down the Jezreel Valley, and you're looking towards your right, you'd see like En-Herod and Gilboa and all that stuff. And then you look towards the east, you see the mountains of Gilead. And so that's kind of like, if memory serves, it's kind of where the Golan Heights end to the south, and then you have the mountains of Gilead. So this is where they wind up. Now, it says, verse 22, and Laban was told on the third day that Jacob had fled. And so he took his brethren with him and pursued him for 7 days. So that would make it like maybe 10 days. So how far did they get? Did they get to Gilead from there? You know, they're having to make, whatever it is, they're making pretty decent pace. And so he took his brethren with him, pursued him for 7 days' journey, and overtook him in the mountains of Gilead. But God had come to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said to him, be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. That's just another way of saying, be careful what you do when you get there. If you deal poorly with him, you'll answer to me, is a kind of the implied part from this. And so Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mountains, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mountains of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what have you done that you have stolen away unknown to me? It means that you've left in secret, and that you have carried away my daughters with captives, like captives that have been taken with the sword. You're acting like someone who has plundered my goods and ran off in the middle of the night. And so that's how it was seen. Now, by this time, we already have read two things that have been happening back home. Jacob has overheard the sons of Laban saying, look at Jacob, everything that he has belongs to Dad. The writing's on the wall with this. And even his interactions, Laban towards Jacob, certainly don't seem very favorable. He can see it on his face. He mentions it to his wives, and his wives are pretty fed up with their father too. And really what should have been something that may have taken a month or two to go and find your wife, which should have been Rachel, is now a 20-year ordeal. Yeah, it's time. And so they're on their way back, and here's what happens. So, it says, so verse 27, why did you flee away secretly and steal away from me and not tell me? For I might have sent you away with joy of songs and timbrel and harp. I might have. I might have just tried to rip you off and take my daughters back and do something awful to you. There's the other thing that's implied, just not spoken. So its whole thing is, you're such a bad guy, Jacob, and this is Laban saying this stuff. Okay. Well, he says, and you didn't allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Now you have done foolishly in so doing. And it is in my power to do to you harm, but the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful that you do not speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. Now, what an interesting thing, because the next statement, again, you want to ask Laban, so Laban, when was the last time that your idols spoke to you in a dream like that? Answer would have been, well, never. But what's his next thing? Oh, verse 30, and now you have surely gone because you greatly long for your family or your father's house, but why did you steal my gods? Well, basically, this would probably, you would figure, would be about the last thing that he should be concerned with, because now he's actually heard directly from God. It would make the idols seem pretty puny by this time, wouldn't you think? Instead, now it's again, you've taken from me. He first starts off with the daughters and all the other implications of that, the livestock and the sons, the grandsons, all of those things. Now you're leaving, and oh, by the way, you stole my gods as well. Well, you'll see in verse 31, so Jacob answered and he said to Laban, let me answer the real question, because I was afraid, for I said, perhaps you would take your daughters from me by force. If I was to come and tell you I wanted to go. Just remember when he was there before, all he asked for when he first met Laban, hey, I've seen your daughter Rachel. I would like to take her as wife. What would it take? And so, basically Laban says, well, it's not right that you should work for me for free, so what would be a fair thing? And so it turns out 7 years. So he's thinking 7 years Rachel. Instead, it's 7 years Leah. And then another 7, it's Rachel. Meanwhile, all his sons are born during that time, not in the land of promise, although that's where they're on their way to. But after all of that time, those 20 years, he still had this fearfulness that what Laban would do is take everything back away from him by force. So while Laban's away, and it's 3 days away, he figures, I'll put some distance and head back home. Well, verse 32, with whomever you find your gods, as for the second part of your question, do not let him live. So if you're upset about who stole your gods, whoever it is, don't let him even live once you find it. So he says, now can you imagine being Rachel? Whoops. Now if they had found out that it was Rachel at the time, would they have followed through with that? Would Laban have wanted to kill his own daughter, and would Jacob have allowed his own wife? But he said it. Was it just hyperbole? Was it just being noisy? Or, wow. Well, so he says, with whomever you find your gods, do not let him live. In the presence of our brethren, identify what I have of yours and take it with you. For Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. And so Laban went into Jacob's tent, into Leah's tent, and into 2 of the maids' tents, but did not find them. Then he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household idols, but she had put them in the camel's saddle, and she sat upon them. And Laban searched all about the tent, but did not find them. So again, how impressive is your God? I don't know, you can sit on him. Not very impressive. Well, so at this point, verse 35, and so she said to her father, let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise before you, for the manner of women is with me. And so he searched, but did not find the household items. Now, started searching even her things, but she had told him, whether it was true or not, it's not an appropriate time for you to search. We all understand what this means, right? So he doesn't press the issue, but she was sitting on these things. So, this is comical to me. Well, verse 36. So Jacob was angry, and he rebuked Laban. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass? What is my sin that you have so hotly pursued after me? Although you have searched all my things, what part of your household things have you found? Set it here before my brethren and your brethren, that they might judge between the 2 of us. Now, they didn't find the one thing that he would have really been upset about. Of course, by this time, it's kind of a mockery anyway. You know, it reminds me, I know, a total distraction, but there is that section in Isaiah. I should have actually looked it up so I could tell you the exact verse. But it's kind of funny where God is mocking the people and their idolatry. And he basically said, you know, you'll cut down a tree in the morning, and with a branch you'll fashion your gods, and with the other part of it you'll bake cakes. How impressive is your God? That branch is going to be what we'll worship. That branch, we're going to cook our food with it. And he mocks them for the silliness of this, because they can't speak. Or when they had stolen the Ark of the Covenant. Remember the Philistines, much later in history, and they stole the Ark of the Covenant. And the Philistines thought, great, we've got ourselves a trophy, so they put it in the house of their God. And what do they find every day, or for those days? That their God is face down before the ark. And the following, or the last of last things, the last straw was that his arm, I think it was his arm that was broken when they woke up in the morning. And there's their broken idol in front of the Ark of the Covenant. They said, enough. God is disrespecting our God. Send this thing back. Plus there was all kinds of other really horrible things that had happened to them. I just find this really, really amazing. Humans are so goofy, we will worship just about anything. Until we meet the true and living God, and then you don't need to make anything to fashion him. He's beyond all of that. But how often do we, there's people that I know, when you go and visit their houses, there are all kinds of little idols and things from the various religions because they want to be respectful of all the religions. God is not impressed by any of this. Not in the least. Well, here we see. So Jacob was angry, as we see. And then verse 38 tells us, these 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes, your female goats, have not miscarried their young. And I have not eaten the rams of your flock. That which was torn by beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it. You required it from my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. there I was. In the day of drought, though it consumed me, and the frost by night, my sleep departed from my eyes. Thus I have been in your house for 20 years. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. And you have changed my wages 10 times. You keep moving the goalposts. It shouldn't have been 20 years, but I didn't protest. And so even the idea of loss of the flock was not coming back to Laban and saying, bummer about what happened to your livestock, mine are fine, yours are toast. He would be the one who would incur that loss. So in this, he has dealt well. He had an interesting upbringing and a interesting time back home. And there's some guile in him nonetheless. But he's the honorable man in this case. Unless the God of my father, verse 42, unless the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac have been with me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands, and he has rebuked you last night. Bringing that recognition. Hey, you're the one who said it, but now that you've said it, let me also make sure that you understand the full implication of this. Laban went there probably having much different intentions. But now that he's right on the doorstep of it, God says, be careful what you do. And so Jacob is going to also make sure that he illustrates that point by saying, be really careful, because you came here with a different intent, but God has prevented you. And oh, by the way, all of the success that I've had, and ultimately you've had as well, is because God's been doing these things. So verse 43. Laban answered and said to Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these children, they are my children. It's a way of saying they're also mine. You may look at them as your wives, and you may look at them as your children, but they're also a part of my family. Well, I think that is less important. It seems as though Laban's just really kind of bent out of shape of what he would have seen as an overt slap in his face, a disrespecting. He can go ahead and deal with his flocks, and he can deal with all the rest of that, but he didn't like the way that this was handled. If I'm Jacob, I don't know that I would have stuck around either. Laban's kids are talking. Your dad's looking at you, your father-in-law's looking at you kind of weird. Yeah, maybe it's time to go. Well, verse 44, now therefore, come and let us make a covenant, and you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. And so Jacob took a stone, and he set it up as a pillar. Then Jacob said to his brethren, gather stones. And they took these stones, they made a heap, and they all ate there on that heap. And Laban called it this unpronounceable word in Aramaic. That's what, I'll tell you what the translation is in a second. But Jacob called it Gilead. And basically what it means is that this is a heap of rocks, or a heap of witness. It is, every time that you would look at it, it would be a reminder. And this was something that they had done. It was a very common, if you will, kind of practice. Remember, 20 years ago, he had done it at Bethel. That was the reminder that when he would look at it, he would say, this is the house of God. This was just the place that I went to. But from that point on, it was known as the house of God, because that's what Jacob saw. God met him there, and so he made this stone. Think of it where Jacob did the same thing at the end of his life, last chapter of the book of Jacob, and of Joshua rather, book of Jacob. Goodness, Chris, book of Joshua, last chapter. As Joshua is really at the end of his life, and he is trying to tell the children of Israel in his absence, his fear was that they would not follow God, and so he has this back and forth. And if I could just paraphrase. You guys aren't going to follow God. Yes, we will. No, you won't. Yes, we will. No, you won't. Yes, we will. Great. Let's put a rock, a stone right here in the middle, a reminder to you that you've made this oath this day. And if you break it, let that blood be upon your hands. As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. It's a reminder. All right? So this is that same kind of a situation. Now, it's going to imply a lot of different things. And so they start adding to it. It is this remembering that this is the place where we met face to face, and there were some things that were said. So they named it the heap of witness. And so what's the witness? So Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me. This day, therefore, the name is called Gilead. It is also called Mizpah, which means tower, or a place of observation where somebody would oversee something. Okay? Now, who's the one who's going to oversee and what's going to be overseen? Verse 49, it's going to be called Mizpah, because he said, may the Lord watch between you and me, and when we are absent one from another. And if you afflict my daughters, or if you take other wives besides my daughters, although no man is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. So, let's face it. Now, again, if I can, this to me is just kind of comical. The fact that he has, quote, daughters now in Jacob's possession is because he didn't want Leah to go without. And he said, well, it's not our custom. And so that's why you had Leah first. Now, there are some people that would say that there was something wrong with Leah. That's not what the text tells us. All that we know is for whatever reason, he was very much enamored and loved Rachel. That was immediate from the moment that he laid eyes on her, though she was the younger. And it was Laban who said, well, I've given you Leah because that's our custom. Now Jacob could have said, yeah, but you didn't tell me that at the beginning. How come? Instead, Leah is given to him. It was done under different pretense. You can go back and read that whole chapter. There was all kinds of weirdness going on with that. And, you know, it became a big competition between the sisters of who was going to have the heirs. And what a mess. What a sordid thing that was. But now here, Laban is worried about his daughters. Okay, well, let's say his motives are genuine and forget about all the stuff he's done in the past. Be careful about how you take care of my daughters. God is your witness. Then Laban said to Jacob, here is this heap, and here is this pillar which I have placed between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is also a witness, that I will not pass beyond this heap to you, and you will not pass beyond this heap and this pillar to me to do harm. As though that was what he was expecting. Now again, the irony in this is Jacob wasn't expecting Laban to show up in the first place. So now Laban is saying, you can't go past this pillar to do harm to me. You could have pictured Jacob saying, well, then why did you pursue me? What's the big deal? Interesting. Well, probably because he got the face-to-face from God. And now is kind of afraid that Jacob may retaliate. However it may be, it doesn't give us a lot of detail. We just go on. The God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Jacob. So it's that typical thing of, you know, by the family's honor we make these pledges. Then Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain, and he called his brethren to eat bread. And they ate bread, and they stayed all night on that mountain. So then early in the morning Laban arose, and he kissed his sons and his daughters, and he blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned to his place. Notice that there's nothing in there that he even greeted Jacob on the way out. You think stuff had gotten a little tense there? Wow. Yeah, not good. Well, so they press on towards where they're going. By the time that they are in the mountains of Gilead, as they're coming in from the east, they're going to be coming into the land. And Bethel is really kind of not far from this. So you can see that their journey is really kind of coming to that end where he gets to Bethel, or he's on his way to Bethel. And, you know, obviously he's going to be coming down a little bit further eventually. But in verse 32, or chapter 32, verse 1, we get this. So Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. So he's going to have some interesting encounters in 32 when it comes to these interesting messengers. He's already had one in the last chapter. Well, it says in verse 2, then Jacob saw them and said, this is God's camp. And so he called the name of that place Mahanaim, I guess. Give it a shot. That's probably about as good as we can do. Which basically means two encampments, or two hosts, or two groups. There's a few different ways you could look at it. But the point was, there is my group, and then there is this host of angels. There are two hosts there. One is very supernatural or invisible. The other ones are him and his family and all of their possessions. And so these two meet there. So then from that place, Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau. Now, this is kind of the two-part of it. He had to get out of where he was to get to the place where he was going. But remember, when he left 20 years ago, what did Esau say? As soon as this whole thing is taken care of with Dad, I'm taking Jacob out. So furious with him because he took on the blessing. Now remember, we go back, in case you weren't here when we were doing that study, remember, earlier in their history, Esau gave up his birthright to Jacob just because he was hungry. And then then Jacob, in that part where it shows he is a man who understood guile, gets on board with Mom's plan to deceive Dad, who can't even see anymore, and portrays himself as being Esau, and he gets the blessing, which is the 1-2 of that. First of all, there is the birthright that goes to the oldest, which the oldest gave up, Esau. And then there was the blessing that the father had bestowed upon, in this case, Jacob. So, Jacob sent messengers, got to get this thing figured out with Esau. 20 years later, he does this with his brother, and he sends them to the land of Syria and to the country of Edom. So figure the part of Jordan that is east of the Dead Sea and south and east. So around the Dead Sea in that basic area, but on the Jordanian side. So it said, and he commanded to them, saying, "Speak thus to my lord Esau. Thus your servant Jacob says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now." So for the last 20 years I've been with Laban. Now notice he condescends to this. Now, it's not that he feels somehow inferior, but he is making an attempt at peace, because he knows how this was 20 years ago, but he has no idea just how angry Esau may still be. Does he still have the same intentions? This is just kind of the overture. What can I do? So he lowers himself to do this. And so the messengers return to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau." And I'm picturing Jacob. Yeah, what did he say? What did he say? Well, here's what they said. "So he is also coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." What does that sound like to you? Oh, yeah, we went to go see your brother, told him that you were here. Well, what is he going to do? Oh, he's got 400 guys coming with him. They want to come see you. They don't give him any other details that the text gives us, but we do know what his reaction is. And there's a very important lesson here. Let's read on. "So Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed." So there was fear, but it's like, not only is there fear, what do I do? Remember where the Bible tells us in Proverbs, it was obviously after this time, you lean not to your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge God and He will direct your paths. That's what we know, right? Now, he could very easily have done that. He does things in the wrong order. Have you ever heard the term ready, fire, aim? That's what he's doing here. Ready, fire, aim. Principles. Overriding things that should govern every decision. He's heard them. Jacob, I want you to leave Laban. I want you to go back to where you came from. I will be with you. That should settle it, right? Everything should be governed by that promise. Can we agree? So, another time when something similar to this happened. Let's remember, from this point in history, there is still a lot that's going to go on between the sons of David, the sons of Jacob. There's that time where they're going to go and escape the famine and all the things that were happening in Israel. They're going to go to Egypt. They're going to be under Joseph's care. Things are going to be good until another Pharaoh comes. They're going to have their 400 years of servitude. And then they're going to be taken by Moses and brought back to the land that they should have had in the first place. But remember when it was that they went in and spied out the land. There were the spies that went in, and they came back with the report. Man, my paraphrase, the land is awesome. Problem is, it's filled with giants, and it consumes its inhabitants. Problem. Why don't we just stay where we are? Well, Joshua and Caleb understood the overriding principle. God has given us the land. So I don't care what these other 10 guys say. Joshua and Caleb says, God has given it to us. It's His problem. Let's go. They were the ones who were willing to say, circumstances mean nothing. God's promises override any circumstance. They believed, they trusted, they walked by faith. Here in this case, Jacob seems to have forgotten what God had said. I'm going to be with you. And you'll notice in his prayer, he does mention this. But he does it in reverse order. So he starts to put together the plan. So he says, he was greatly afraid, verse 7, and distressed. And so he divided the people that were with him, and the flocks, and the herds, the camels, into 2 companies. And he said, now, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company, which is left, will escape. Now, he doesn't say, if it turns out that he's here with bad intention, if you see one of us get attacked, the other ones run away. He's assuming this is going to be a confrontation. So, verse 8. And so he says, verse 9 rather. So then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your own country and to your family, and I will deal well with you. If he had done that at the beginning, he could have said, God, you told me to go. Now, it sounds like Esau is coming to me. What should I do? You know that God answers those kinds of questions, does he not? At least, certainly in these cases, he did. He's already been talking to him. Remember, he's the one who told him, hey, when it comes to all of your livestock, I did that. Go back home. Go back. I'm the God of Bethel. Come back home. If he remembered that, he would have prayed first. Hey, this thing about Esau coming, it doesn't sound good. So God, what do I do? Well, he does it in reverse order. He said, the God of my father Abraham and of Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country and with your family, and I will deal well with you. I am not worthy of the least of all of these mercies and of all of the truth which you have shown to your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. So deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me, and the mother with the children. For you have said, I will surely treat you well, make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Had he started with that premise, that was the promise. So that would mean that even if Esau came with 10,000 men with complete malicious intent, they would have been defeated, and Jacob would not have lifted a hand in the battle. Right? How do we know that? Because later in their history, that's exactly how it went. And to this point, the fact that he even exists means that Isaac existed. Isaac never should have existed because Abraham and Sarah were way past childbearing. How quickly we forget. Yeah? He should remember God has been doing the miraculous since my family started. If not for God, I wouldn't even be here, is what Jacob could say. Now, if you stand upon God's promise and His Word, you pretty much at that point are able to say, if God's made a promise that is still future, I'm invincible until that time. But, again, circumstances so quickly override us. Now, we should learn from this, and instead of learning from it, we kind of sometimes just think, okay, good, I feel off the hook because I'm not the only person who wavers at the promises of God. Or am I admitting too much? Are you guys starting to lose, any kind of respect for me as a pastor? Really, man? It sounds like you're always having a crisis of faith, Pastor Chris. It's a human thing. No matter how long you walk with God, circumstances can sometimes override what you know to be true. Well, this is one of those times. Well, as we see, so he lodged there that same night, and he took what came to his hand as a present for Esau his brother. So 200 female goats came to him, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, and 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 foals. And they delivered them to the hand of his servants, and every drove by itself, or every portion of that herd by itself. And he said to the servants, pass over before me and put some distance between successive droves. Now, do these people who are leading these flocks, do they know what his worry is? Esau's coming with 400 guys and he's going to wipe us all out. So go meet him and bring all this stuff. If they know the plan, you would think, well, wait a minute, why are you sending me out first? Send one of those guys. I don't know if they're in on the whole thing, but he says, this is what I want you to do. In succession, and you're all going to have the exact same thing that you're going to tell them. Here's what you're going to say. You're going to say, these are your servant Jacob's, and it is a present sent to my lord Esau, and behold, he is behind us. He's coming. But he wanted us to go before you with these presents so that you would understand his intention. So they're kind of moving towards one another, it would seem. He's behind us. And so that would be the impression that he's, it's kind of an entourage. So verse 19, so he commanded the second and the third and to all that followed the droves, saying, in this manner you will speak to Esau when you find him. And so also say, behold, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. And so the present went on over before him, but he himself lodged that night in the camp. So he waited, sends these guys out. Interesting thing that happens meanwhile back at the camp. Verse 22. So he arose that night, and he took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and he crossed over the ford of Jabbok. And so he took them, sent them over the brook, and he sent over what he had, and then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. So what we have here is, okay, send my family ahead. I don't know what's going to happen. Now, here Jacob has done some things with it that seem like he gets it. And then there are those other times when you just go, my goodness, what a conniver. In this case, you can see that even this imperfect man, God is going to do such a miraculous thing in this. And still, even at this, you're going to find this persistence of Jacob. Rather than trying to come to the bottom of things, sometimes your own persistence can create quite a mess. Well, you see here in verse 25. So he saw that he did not prevail against him. Well, who is him? Again, verse 24. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. This is no ordinary man. So they're wrestling all night. Jacob is not able to make any real headway. And so it says, now, when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now, the prevailing is this man. Notice that Jacob just won't give up. So what does he do? It says he touches his hip. Basically, this, whatever this touch is, was it a supernatural thing, kind of like I just touched it and it happened, or was it, that he hit him on the hip? However it was, it messed him up so bad that he walked with a limp the rest of his life. This is no ordinary injury. But it also shows the persistence of Jacob, that even with the injury, after all of this grappling and wrestling, and it gives the impression that it is that kind of a thing, but you can see that there's a big spiritual matter going on here too. This is going to change the course of the nation, the thing that goes on here. He's going to get a change of name in this whole episode. So, this, after it happened, his socket of his hip was now out of joint as he wrestled with this man. Now, I'm not going to do any other movie references. There's one that comes to mind, but he's obviously defeated, but he's not giving up. And so he said, let me go, this man that he wrestled with, let me go, for the day breaks. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And what's really funny is, now some of you have probably never heard me say this, I am praying for a video vault in heaven with the highlights of all of these kind of things, because I really want to see this one. I'm picturing Jacob, obviously not able to walk, his hip's out of joint, and I just picture him as like holding on for all he's worth to this man's leg and saying, I'm not going to let you go. And picturing this man saying, you can't even walk and you're making threats. You're not going to let me go. All I would need to do is kind of flick my foot and that would be the end of this. Instead, his persistence, I will not let you go until you bless me. So, he said to him, what is your name? And so he says, Jacob. Now, obviously this man knows who he is. I believe that there are these things that we call theophanies, Christophanies. Depends on who you're asking. But there sure appears as though there are those times when none other than God appears in physical form. And how do we know that? It's because of how Jacob addresses him, and if it was any mere angel, he would have corrected him. Similar to what the angel does when he corrects John in the book of Revelation. Chapter 19, I fell at his feet to worship him, and what does he say? Get up. Don't do that. You worship God. I'm just a servant like you are. That's what angels would say. Well, this one who can with a touch dislocate your hip and make you walk with a permanent limp says, what's your name? So he says, Jacob. And he says, well, from now on, your name will no longer be called Jacob, but rather Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men, and you have prevailed. What a cool thing. Now, you will find that throughout their history from that time on, this nation that is known by its tribes, his sons, are interchangeably sometimes referred to as Jacob and sometimes as Israel. God addresses the nation by both of those names. Pretty cool stuff. Well, of course, the translation of Israel is the one who strives with God. He gives the definition of it right there by explaining it to him. He says it's no longer Jacob, but rather it's going to be Israel. And why is that? Because you have struggled with God and with men, and you've prevailed. So then Jacob asked him, saying, "Tell me your name, I pray." And he said, "Why is it that you ask me about my name?" And so he blessed him there. And so Jacob called the name of that place Peniel. And for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Pretty cool. He basically is able to say, I saw God face to face and survived. I got a bad hip out of the whole thing, and I limp, but I made it through. So, again, if this was just an angel, he would have never said, I've seen God face to face. There's an interesting back and forth that takes place. And so, just as he crossed over Penuel and the sun rose on him and he limped on his hip. I love the way the Bible puts things. He limped on his hip. It means, he detectable limp. There was damage done to him. And notice, it was such a monumental occasion that it says in verse 32, "Therefore, to this day, the children of Israel do not eat the muscle of that shank, which is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip and the muscle that shrank." So this is the point. They would, whenever, in a way of remembrance of this, that damage that was inflicted on Jacob, it became something that they would do as a recognition of what took place there, that they would hold that as a sacred thing and not even partake of that part. Kind of interesting. Shows you how much of this history and how much it means to them. And, again, as I was kind of reviewing and looking through the things that are taking place even right now in the nation, I stopped to think about how much God has invested in these people. How much He has invested in the nation, in its religious practice and all the rest of it. And the day is going to come when they're going to see Him and they're going to recognize Him for who He is. Zechariah mentions that they will look at Him when he returns, and they will look at one and they will mourn for him as they mourn for a son, the one whom they have pierced, is what Zechariah records. I believe it's chapter 12 when it talks about that day. We go there, when we're there, it's the Mount of Olives where He steps foot. And that day when they'll recognize who He is. I'm just amazed at that. All that God has done to preserve them. And here they are back in the land, and we see the same kind of just belligerence and hatred of them that has existed through the ages. And yet God continually blesses them. It's pretty amazing stuff. So with that, let's stand. We'll have a closing word of prayer, and we'll have a closing song. Father, we thank You once again. We can come to Your Word, and we can become familiar with the history. And it's a history that's not just something back then, but it has an ongoing fulfillment in our day here. And there are plenty of things that we can learn from this as far as the successes and failures of people who walk by faith. Also not trusting in our own understanding, but trusting in You. And so as we study these chapters and learn this bit of history, we pray that we would become students of Your Word, students of that history, making the proper application to what we read. We thank You for Your faithfulness to us, and we thank You for Your Word. In Jesus' name.